Everyone loves a good story. It has been a part of being a human since we first learned how to make noises after discovering how to walk out of water. And what can make video game stories even that much better is the ability to hide secret stories, characters, and knowledge inside of their very own game. No game does this better in my opinion than the franchise-defining Gears of War 2. Not only do we get one of the greatest campaigns in all of video game history, but even the hidden subplots are amazing. Today, we uncover those mysterious stories. Before we delve into those hidden stories, let's do a quick summary of the main Gears of War 2 story for anyone that hasn't played the game or needs a reminder. If you'd rather skip straight to the mysteries, fast forward to the timestamp below. The final stronghold for humanity exists in one final city called Jacinto. Despite humanity's victory in Gears of War 1 with the Lightmass offensive, the Locusts are stronger than ever, and even worse, somehow they are sinking human cities. On the verge of defeat, the COG initiates Operation Hollow Storm to bring the attack to the Locust homeland for the first time in the 14-year-long war. They battle their way to the city of Landown, where thousands of Gears are sent down into the Hollows through grind lifts. Their main objective was to find the Locust capital and set off a beacon so that thousands of more Gears can be sent down and rip out the heart of their invaders. Although the first wave was unsuccessful, Delta Squad discovered that the Locusts are using a giant worm called the Rift Worm to sink their cities. They also learned that the Locusts are taking prisoners and processing them, which basically means cruel, vile torture. The Rift Worm nearly eats them, but they survive and defeat the worm from the inside. They are then sent off to the secret, abandoned New Hope research facility to learn more about the Locust origins and hopefully find out where the Locust capital could be. There they find horrific monsters called the Sires and discover that the lab and team was shuffled off to Mount Gadar after being shut down, so Delta travels there and journeys back underground. Speaking with stranded survivors, they get word that they are nearing the Locust capital called Nexus. First, Marcus and Dom branch off to search for Dom's wife Maria, but sadly she had undergone the Locust processing and was in a vegetative state. Dom, after 13 years of searching, has to put his wife out of her misery. They then move on to find Nexus, and when they are close enough, set off the beacon, which begins wave 2 of the operation. Baird and Cole reunite with Delta, and together they invade the Locust Royal Palace, where they learn about the Locust's true enemy and objective. All this time, the Locusts have been fighting the Lambent, which is a parasite that infects the hosts and uses them in their army. And the Locusts have been sinking human cities so that they can flood the hollows with water in an attempt to destroy the parasite completely. Delta then finds the Locust Queen, who strangely enough turns out to be a human female. She knows of Marcus Phoenix through his father, Adam Phoenix, but leaves before we can get any info. Our attempts to capture the Queen fail, and we flee back to Jacinto to warn humanity, along the way killing Mira's new High General called Scourge. When we rendezvous with Command again, the plan has become to use the Locust idea against them and sink the city before the Locusts can evacuate out of the Hollows. Marcus and Dom get sent back underground one final time to open a sinkhole, and they do so on the back of a hijacked Brumach. When the sinkhole is open, the Brumach destroys a Lightmass bomb they were going to use to destroy the city, but thankfully the Brumach stepped in a motion which caused it to go lambent. Then, undergoing the infection process, it grows and essentially turns itself into a massive bomb. Delta then uses the Hammer of Dawn to kill this lambent Brumach, which sets off a giant explosion that crumbles the city, flooding the Hollows. The remnants of humanity set off away from the sunken city victorious, but now without a proper home. Now that you know the given main story, we can investigate the unknown stories. Even with the world crumbling in on itself and humanity essentially being one bad day away from extinction, the secrets and cover-ups of the government carry on. Some big, some little, some new, some old. The most subtle one we learn about is seen in the Jacinto Sentinel newspaper, where Chairman Prescott himself is questioned on whether or not there is a secret safe haven out in the world that he and the COG are hiding. He, as a politician, denies these allegations despite them being factually correct. There was a secret safe haven, that being the island of Azura. These rumors most likely circulated due to Prescott visiting the island every now and then, so his absence may have sparked curiosity in the population.
Hey, Prescott was really investing in the crazy tyrant technology.
During the Locust War, only the elite of the COG, such as scientists, engineers, and the wealthy, were secretly taken to this island to remain protected while the rest of humanity fought the Locust. We see this island in full force in the sequel Gears of War 3. The government covered up all these disappearances and the island itself, and is our first introduction to the corruption of the COG. Lobbying government officials and organizations can be found in every issue in every level of the society. This magazine shows that the world before the Locust War had automobiles that could run off solar energy and were far cheaper and safer than emulsion-fueled options, yet their manufacturers were struggling to get them sold. Almost like the government didn't want them to become mainstream. Perhaps they wanted to reap the rewards of the 79-year-long pendulum wars that they just fought over emulsion. The second largest cover-up we discover in-game involves a disease called rust lung. We see some of its victims inside the Jacinto Medical Center, learning that recent cases have been skyrocketing since the light mass offensive, which was our victory at the end of Gears of War 1.
What'd you say these guys got?
Rust lung, emotion sickness. Cases have been popping up all over since the light mass bombing. It is a horrible way for a warrior to die.
Contagious?
They say it's not, but I'd keep my distance.
This ambulance driver log gives us 4 patients and their symptoms, all coming from Timgad Valley where the bombing occurred. Their symptoms include coughing up blood and brown mucus, nausea, bleeding from the ears, severe chest pains, and troubled breathing. However, despite these serious and very clear signs of deadly sickness, medical staff and government authorities worked together to cover up these cases and clear the infected soldiers for duty. With the upcoming operation to invade the Locust Hollows, they wanted every soldier they could get and thus chose to ignore these soldiers and lied to them that they would get better. Specifically, Dr. Vivian Merriweather was leading the charge as we see in this medical file for Sergeant Jonathan Harper. Both characters we will hear from again later on. Dr. Merriweather falsifies his diagnosis and records stating, physical and diagnostic evaluation showed no chronic illnesses and no signs of bacterial infection. Expect a full recovery with no side effects. Another staff member, Dr. Nicolette Shannon, wrote in her journal that she suspects Merriweather has been ignoring the obvious symptoms and appears to be less concerned than the rest of us. Shannon questions if her close ties to the COG administration could be affecting her judgment. This conspiracy becomes even more clear-cut looking at the supply requisition put in by Dr. Shannon, hoping to receive more medical supplies for her growing number of patients. The request was quickly denied due to the upcoming operation. The strong restrictions by the COG grow tighter and tighter, demonstrated by this COG proclamation, showing that mandatory curfew has been enacted with orders to shoot any non-military personnel on site. Their reasoning is that Locust and humans can be hard to differentiate at night, so no chances will be taken. Should any civilian be caught and not shot down immediately, they will face arrest, imprisonment, and/or possible injury. Lastly, the largest cover-up, perhaps in the entire Gears of War franchise, was over Dr. Niles Sampson and his experiments at New Hope and Mount Kadar. As we come to learn in-game, Niles during the Pendulum Wars was tasked with finding a cure for rust lung and attempted to do so through testing the effects of emulsion on the children of emulsion-infected miners. Through horrific and flat-out evil experiments, Niles eventually created the Sires who were the predecessors to the Locust. And while the government didn't approve of this and shut them down as soon as they found out, they still covered up the atrocities committed at both of these facilities. Niles spearheaded this entire operation, leading their efforts and keeping around scientists that agreed with his goal. First, Niles comes from a generational wealth background seen in this Alima City Help Wanted ad, requesting a full-time house cleaner for a large Alima City household. This large house has been in the Sampson family for generations. This ad was put out by some relative of Niles named Julia Sampson, who appears to be a perfectionist, which resonates a lot with Niles' character.
Our facility maintains the highest possible standards, I assure you. We take great pride in our work here.
While leading the New Hope research facility, Niles was meticulous about keeping all the information a secret and in-house only. This inter-office memo shows his disappointment about information leaking to media outlets, which resulted in inquiries to the Department of Health. He wants their work to be hidden from the public and even the COG, stating they are making the future a better place, despite essentially torturing and offing children. One of these patients was a 15-year-old female named Ruth. Like most of the other children, Niles injected her with emulsion and other concoctions to see how her body reacted. Unfortunately for her, the results were worse than anyone could imagine. She experienced extreme swelling in her joints, constant extreme pain, erratic and unpredictable behavior, discoloration in her eyes, rough, labored breathing, her nails growing at a faster rate, but her hair at a substantially slowed rate. With all of this in mind, Niles showed nearly no sympathy to poor Ruth, stating he would try to find a medication to help her with her pain, but it would have to not affect his studies over her. Most likely, Ruth would have turned into a screaming, bloodthirsty sire. And like a true villain, Dr. Niles calls them his children. And Ruth was just one of many children, and sadly, we aren't entirely sure how long New Hope was running for. Down the line, we run across markings on the wall with 182 tallies. There's no notes or anything to signify what they mean. 182 days? Weeks? Months? Whatever it meant, it was too long for it to be happening to a child. Even some of the scientists begin to have a change of heart, especially when their safety was becoming compromised. Cruel coming from someone actually working on the experiments. This bloodied memo from Dr. Doug Sato tells us that the Sires were under constant sedation during their studies, and yet one of them broke free and mauled another scientist named Sven. He was ripped apart by the Sire and presumably killed. The coward Sato began writing his resignation letter and urging fellow scientist Dr. Stephanie Zimmer, who received this memo, to do the same. We also get a journal entry from Dr. Zimmer right before she attempts to flee the facility. She states that working with the Sires was like working with rabid dogs, except they're much smarter, more conniving, and they're brutal. Like they were bred to kill and torture. Again, ironic coming from a scientist that committed these atrocities to the children. As I stated, New Hope would eventually get shut down once the government discovered the terrible experiments done there. To prevent the news from getting out, Chairman Monroe and his administration would cover up the entire facility, keeping it highly classified to the point that only future chairmen would be able to learn about it. Though part of the Monroe administration would secretly shuffle off Niles and the rest of the remaining team to Mount Gadar, where they could continue their experiments and eventually perfect the Locust.
When we are fully cleansed and the truth comes forth, will we listen? Will we listen? Listen.
Now we'll move on to the part that I'm sure everyone has been waiting for, the Locust. Operation Hollow Storm has Delta Squad and thousands of other gears traveling down into the Hollows, invading the Locust on their home turf. And what we discover is terrifying. First and foremost, we're not the first humans to walk in the Hollows, as we find hundreds to thousands of other humans being imprisoned and used for slave labor. And this did not start recently, but instead has been going on long before the Locust even emerged and revealed themselves to humanity. While Marcus and Dom are searching for Dom's wife Maria, they come across a Locust terminal which they use to catalog their human prisoners, separating them across the Hollows and categorizing them through unique Locust symbols. We also come across a Locust jailer document which shows the Locusts are extremely organized with shifts, routines, techniques, and procedures. They aren't just a devastating army, but an intelligent species, smart enough to have their own version of cog tags called Locust emblems, which function to identify the unique soldier wearing them, essentially exactly like real-world dog tags. They also have their very own calendar system which is unique to their species. Since they live underground, they can't track the sun or the weather, so instead, they use the flow of emulsion. Half of the year it flows one way, and the other half it goes the other direction, and thus, each Locust month has an opposite. At first, we can only decipher a few immediately like Nexus, Queen, and Emulsion, but further investigation gives us the following. Queen, Fire, Drone, Leviathan, Danger, Nemesis, Emulsion, Water, Human, Krill, Secure, Cedar. Every month has an opposite, Queen and Emulsion, Fire, Water, Drone, Human, Leviathan, Krill, Danger, Secure, Nemesis, Cedar. So we've established that they're smart, but let's not forget the brutal, twisted mindset that they have. Sometimes they create and wear necklaces decorated with human fingers on them, or they create a paper-like material for their scrolls using the skin of captured humans. This particular Cantus scroll gives us insight on their religion, which we learn a lot about while traversing through the Hollows. The worm answers, "My name is Horde, for we are many with," before the writing gets cut off. It seems the Locusts praise some sort of worm and call themselves Horde. Horde is referring to them being a hive mind, where they are all connected in a single network in which their queen can lead them to prosperity. Our next discovery is the Trinity of Worms artifact, which was symbolized on the back of the previous Cantus scroll. Trinity of Worms is the name of the Locust religion, and the worms they reference are the rift worms we see during the game. Incredibly massive worms with the ability to burrow through the ground, which the Locust used in order to sink the human cities of Tolan, Montevado, and Alima. On this artifact, we get a glimpse into the religious mantra, Queen making drones, drones protecting Nexus, before it gets cut off again due to being unable to fully decipher it. In lore, we later come to get the full mantra being, the Queen makes strong drones, drones secure Nexus, Nexus covers the Queen. A full cycle where each part of the society works in harmony together to create the perfect utopia. These three virtues also correspond to the three rift worms that the Locusts believe are out there, one for Queen, one for drones, and one for Nexus. They praise these rift worms as gods for creating the hollows that the Locusts live in and allowing for life to sprout down there. You might be asking, where did these rift worms come from and why has one made its presence known only now? The riftworms are an ancient entity, most likely being around far longer than any known living species on the planet. And this Locust tablet tells us exactly why one has appeared, and that was due to the Lightmass offensive that occurred at the end of Gears of War 1. The riftworm, and presumably all the others, were in a deep slumber for a very long time, but the massive explosion of the Lightmass bomb awoke one of them, allowing the Locusts to use their mystical abilities to communicate with them and have it assist them in their war efforts. Moving on, we find a couple battle maps from the Locust, one defense and one offense. The defense plans indicates attacks coming from below them, so it does not refer to humanity. Instead, it is referring to the Lambent, which we come to find out about during the game. The Lambent or Glowies are the infected version of the Locusts that are both engaged in an entirely different war. The entire time the Locust have been invading humanity, the Lambent have been attacking the Locust. More accurately, the Lambent War started 7 years before E-Day when the Locust emerged from the ground to invade humanity. So they've been fighting a two-front war this entire time, losing their home territory to the Lambent. This parasite would later become the largest threat to all of life on Serra in the next game, Gears of War 3. Our second map is the invasion map, picturing Locust tunnels underneath a human city, possibly Jacinto, but unlikely due to the granite bedrock beneath the city. This made it nearly impossible for the Locust to burrow through, which is why humanity was using it as their last bastion for safety. An off-topic but interesting question gets asked when discovering this map. Where are the Locust children and babies? Presumably they would see some evidence of them being down in the hollows, and yet they have found none except for this invasion map, which they speculate could be a Locust kid's drawing. Unfortunately, this remains a mystery as we are still in the unknown on how the Locusts grow up and how they reproduce. But one thing we do learn about going down in the hollows is the entire experience of one gear during Operation Hollow Storm. This gear was named Jonathan Harper, and his story was so interesting that 8 months after the release of Gears of War 2 in July of 2009, they released a comic called Harper's Story visualizing his journey. So alongside the collectibles, I can also show the corresponding comic strips. His story begins back with Dr. Vivian Merriweather, the corrupt doctor covering up cases of rust lung. This medical file we went over was Jonathan Harper's, who was experiencing all the awful symptoms of rust lung. But despite that, he was cleared for duty and told he was going to get better. Harper was a sergeant of Echo 9 stationed at the Timgad Valley during the Light Mess Offensive, so unfortunately he was one of the soldiers that got rust lung because of it. We first hear from Harper himself in his first journal entry about half an hour after he exited the grind lift upon reaching the hollows. He found them surprisingly beautiful, but for their mission it was all too quiet. He's still affected by the aches and symptoms of his rust lung, but he had no other choice but to push himself forward if he wanted to see the surface again one day. The quiet would rapidly change to all-out warfare as his squad engaged in heavy Locust forces surrounding them on all sides. Harper was one of the few men that survived the encounter, although being captured by the Locust may be worse than death. As we saw with Ty during the game, the Locust processing is not something to be taken lightly. They were beaten, tortured, humiliated, and the lucky ones were killed. Somehow while being imprisoned, Harper found a journal to write another entry stating that whoever was reading it needed to escape the hollows immediately. He gives more details about the nightmare that he was living through. They got me isolated. I hear people screaming around me, all while he keeps coughing up blood and mucus. The only thing he wants in this world now is to see the sky just one more time. If I'm gonna die, I'm dying like a man. When the next drone guard came to open up his coffin cell, he mustered up the strength and decked him straight in the face, running as fast and far away from the camp as possible. He met up with none other than Corporal Jay Stratton, who we all know from Gears of War 3.
Damn, nearly got it that time.
That candy's like 10 years old, man. You're gonna puke your guts out.
Yeah, well, that's a price I'm willing to pay.
Together with Jace's squad, they made their way back up to the surface. Along the way, they found a little girl and her parents and escorted them back to their evac point where a King Raven was coming to get them. Finally, we find Harper's bloodied cog tags with his final journal entry detailing his last thoughts before leaving the world. He was proud and happy that he was able to see the sky one last time. I made it. I survived the hollow. He saw the King Raven take off with the family and the rest of the surviving gears inside. I keep hearing that little angel telling me thank you, her sweet little voice. She said she'd pray for me. She said she'd pray for us all. Thus ending the story of Jonathan Harper, one of thousands of casualties during Operation Hollow Storm, but one of the few that made it back to the surface. He was so close to escaping with his life, but despite his death, he was happy to save a family and die looking up at the sky. Like Harper, we get glimpses into the stories of fallen soldiers during Operation Hollow Storm by finding their cog tags and reading their final journal entries or letters. Our first was Private Dylan Murphy, who finally became a King Raven pilot for KR-59 after first serving as a regular infantryman. We may have actually heard from Dylan during the campaign as Marcus speaks with KR-59 while fighting through the hospital.
5-9, hold your fire. There are gears and civilians in this building.
Roger that. Keep us posted.
Dylan was excited to be up in the sky, stating, "I'm gonna soar, man. No one flies like me. The Locusts better start saying their prayers, because they got a devil in the sky watching down on them." But despite their enthusiasm, at some point during the Locust incursion on Jacinto, Dylan and their King Raven was shot down, killing them. Our next soldier goes simply by Sammy, who survived the Jacinto incursion but fell during the assault on Landdown. Like many other soldiers, Sammy wrote letters to his loved ones that had already met their fate sometime during the war. We get to read his final letter to his late mother, giving his emotions and thoughts about Operation Hollow Storm. "I'm nervous, Ma. I'm not afraid to admit it. For all we know, this is the last night of our lives. Sammy's mother told him to live like every day was his last, and with what they were about to go through, he expects it may very well be his last day soon. Stars look especially shiny tonight. I'd like to think that winking one's you, Ma, watching over me. Help me get through tomorrow. I promise I'll cherish each and every day. Our third soldier was Private Hank Bissell, who funnily enough shares the same Coalition service ID as Private Dylan Murphy. A tiny little mistake from the devs or COG government, who knows. Hank is unique amongst our fallen soldiers here as he was recruited into the army due to Operation Lifeboat. We'll discuss it a bit more later, but the summary for Operation Lifeboat was simple. You join the army, and your family gets taken care of by the government. This was used to get the Stranded to join the COG and its army to keep their war effort going. Stranded, for those that don't know, was the term used to describe individuals that chose to separate themselves from the COG for one reason or another. Since they weren't associated with the last powerhouse for humanity, and they didn't have a safe home, they were stranded. Hank was one of the many gears sent down during Operation Hollow Storm and was rightfully pissed about the plan and the outcome of him joining the COG. Sign here. Your wife will be taken care of. Sure, you'll see some action, but you'll always be back in Jacinto to see your wife after patrol, he says, presumably mocking the recruitment officer that got him to join. He also mentions that they told them that the grind lifts they used to go down into the hollows could also be used to get back up somehow, though he was never trained on how to do that. So it may have been some more BS the army made up to keep the gears on board with the plan. Hank's COG tags were found in the Alima sinkhole, so sadly he most likely met his end during the sinking either above or below when it occurred. Our next gear is Sergeant Devin Jackson, whose tags we find near the end of the game during the evacuation of Jacinto. I've been loading families onto Ravens all morning. He hoped by the end of the evacuation there would still be some King Ravens left around to get him and his fellow gears out too. Once they come, there ain't gonna be no more Jacinto. We find his tags just outside the command center, killed during the final Locust offensive of Jacinto. Our final gear will be recognized by anyone who has played the game, Private Benjamin Carmine. He joined us in Delta Squad with Marcus and Dom being assigned to them that very same day on his first day. Yes, Operation Hollow Storm was his first day ever out of training. Truly a terrible first day to get in the action. We find a letter he wrote for his older brother Clayton, whom we meet in Gears of War 3. In the letter he states how much he misses Anthony, who was another brother of his who we met and witnessed fall in Gears of War 1. I take comfort knowing that he died a hero, but still, I miss him.
I served with Anthony. He was a good soldier. My respects.
Thanks. Just good to know you died a hero's death.
The Carmine brothers, all four of them, are a very tight-knit family that truly cares and loves for one another. Each of them grew up to be gears, as Ben stated in the campaign.
Yo, you said your name is Carmine? You got a brother was a gear?
Yeah, all four of us. Well, 3 now. You know one of them?
I'll be doing my very best to serve our country and make you and our family proud. Signed Ben, aka The Squirt. Benjamin Carmine nearly escaped the first day of Operation Hollow Storm, but was separated when Delta tried to evac on the King Raven. Later, he was found being torn to shreds and dragged through toxic liquid by Nemesites inside the Riftworm. His final thoughts were of his brothers and his mother, wanting them to know that he loved them very much. So far, we have only been looking at Operation Hollow Storm through the COG's perspective, but we do get some writings from the Stranded perspective. Our first journal comes from a stranded mother named Jennifer. She and her children recently moved to Alima City, hoping for a safer life. She notes that the tremors have been getting worse. Unbeknownst to her and the entire city, was the Riftworm slowly burrowing below them to sink the city. Why does living have to be so hard? She notes how they move from broken home to broken home, just praying for them to stay safe. Unfortunately, Alima City sank, and the whereabouts of Jennifer, her kid Jay, and the other children are unknown. Her journal was found outside the sinkhole, so it may be possible that she and/or the children were kidnapped by the Locust to be processed. When Delta Squad makes their way into Mount Kadar on their Centaur tank, they run into Old Man Chaps and his stranded group. During their discussion about if Chaps had seen Maria, he mentions that she may have been a part of Stu's group. Later in the game, we find a journal entry from Stu himself. We've been down here for weeks now. Was real creepy at first, but now it's kind of like camping. Stu was a leader of his stranded group, and like many others came to find out that ironically, the surface became more dangerous to live on than the underground hollows. So they migrated underground beneath the noses of the Locust. Chaps is supposed to come down here soon too. That'll be good. Which confirms that Stu's group and Maria hadn't been down in the hollows for all that long, possibly for a month or two if we give some leeway. Meaning that Dom was heartbreakingly close to finding Maria before it was too late. After searching for nearly 13 years, she was captured and processed by the Locust maybe just days or a couple weeks before being found by Dom. Makes that whole storyline that much more depressing and nightmarish. Our final stranded story comes from a man named Russell who journeyed with his family away from Montevado to the city of Jacinto. Unknowing to them, the city of Montevado sank during their travels, so them taking the risk to leave to Jacinto was more than worth it. Can finally sleep at night without worrying about the Locust or Krill attacking in the night. I'll be signing up for Lifeboat tomorrow, though they won't be processing my paperwork for a week or so after this land down assault. Unfortunately for Russell and his family, they arrived in Jacinto after months of traveling in the same week that Jacinto would fall and the entire city would be evacuated. While being evacuated, the Locust were finally able to create a sinkhole which was reported in this recon report. This was the first time this had ever occurred, as previously the granite bedrock was too difficult for them to burrow through. So, sadly for Russell, not only were they evacuating the city, but he and his family had to worry about the Locust invading the city. They were also unaware the Krill had gone extinct. For those that aren't sure what the Krill are, we met them in Gears of War 1. They are bat-like creatures that swarm the surface after sunset. They were only able to survive in the dark and would prey and shred on anything that dared to leave the safety of the light.
Stay there. We're coming over.
Stay under the light.
They had only become a terror on humanity when the Locust emerged from the ground, creating new openings for them to venture out of. However, as we can see in this Eagle newspaper, the lightmass bombing, again seen at the end of Gears of War 1, resulted in the extinction of the species. The targeted area of Timgad Valley just so happened to be their breeding ground, so it was a major side victory for humanity. Rounding off the journal, the whereabouts of Russell and his family are unknown. Hopefully they were given a safe journey on the King Raven to leave the city during the evacuation. We can only pray that they did not make the long, risky move to Jacinto only to lose everything within a couple days. Some stranded were fortunate, or unfortunate depending on your point of view, to be able to join the COG through Operation Lifeboat, which we touched on a little bit earlier. Join the army and your family gets taken care of. Some of them that joined became frontline gears, while most of them that we see in this game became assault derrick drivers like our lovable cowboy, Dizzy Wallen.
I ain't got no choice once we took the lifeboat assistance. Family got the groceries, but Daddy got conscripted. Life's a bitch like that.
These derricks were the main transport to land down and housed the grind lifts that sent the gears down. Like most heavy machinery, the grind lifts came with warnings due to past mistakes. Failure to keep hands, feet, and or body inside the grind lift pod during use could lead to injury, bodily trauma, dismemberment, decapitation, and in extreme cases, disembowelment. Not the best idea to try something new in a machine that sends you underground. We get a bit of insight from Dizzy in a munitions requisition form he writes. Can we just get some more damn ammo on these rigs, please? We got more buzzards than bullets. That ain't right. Well, it seems like the supplies for humanity were running even lower than expected, and the COG were losing the ability to supply anyone outside the main troops. The COG are even sending normal, unarmed civilians to aid them, as we see in this truck driver's note. So I got a truck full of fresh ammo, and they want me to deliver it to the Raid complex. What? Are you kidding me? The COG are lucky we're in a war. Bet they'd have a revolt on their hands otherwise. Dizzy also mentions Mo, Morris, and Corey, another 2 Operation Lifeboat participants. We unfortunately witnessed Corey's fate during the drive to land down, getting blown up by a nemesis hitting his rig.
Move into position on my flank. Look out!
This is Mo at D-14. They just got Corey.
Speaking of Landdown, it has a bit of an interesting history that we learn about. Firstly, it houses a Pendulum Wars graveyard and memorial for soldiers that fell during the war. May they rest in peace and know that their brave sacrifices were not in vain. But the largest event that involved Landdown was hinted to us by Ty, speaking of the ominous Winter of Sorrow.
I remember when they took Landdown, during the Winter of Sorrow. It was a bad omen.
An Eagle newspaper describes Landdown as the site of a valiant COG defense during the Winter of Sorrow. This little tidbit is referring to one specific day that gets mentioned again in the Jacinto Sentinel newspaper. Endured a harrowing 24 hours in which Locust forces bombarded the town with grenades, nemesis, and mortars. This nearly day-long attack occurred 5 years after E-Day, with residents feeling like they were experiencing that horrific day all over again. Not only Landdown, but the surrounding areas were under constant sieges by the Locust over the course of months, not letting up their momentum. Major Gerard Leland has asked the COG to deploy more gears to the Landdown barracks. The unending pursuit of the Locust caused Landdown to run out of supplies and, more importantly, manpower, leading to the city falling under Locust control for the next 9 years until it was retaken by the COG during Operation Hollow Storm, or a brief time that is. Sums up perfectly the human experience during the Locust War. All their victories were brief before resuming to lose once again. And we have finally reached the end of our mysteries, or at least the ones this game hinted to us. The Gears of War story is rich and complex, so there are a million other things I could have spoken about or broken down, but then this video would have been about 20 hours long. I really hope you enjoyed the story, so if you did, please leave a like and comment down below what your favorite part was. Thank you to my channel members, and a special big thank you to my elite Onyx Guard, Bizarre Clay, Rocket, Dovanki, and Oloco and Sarado for protecting the channel. Alright, Gears, till next time.